Tony, he had a lot of love to give. Tony met his wife. They had a couple of kids, and he was a really good father. He loved spending time with them. He was a fun dad, just kind of the kind that's, threw the kids up in the air all the time and ran outside with them. There wasn't a kid that didn't love him. Just about every picture ever taken of them, it was always him holding the babies. That's the happiest he'd ever been. But my brother had a hard time with his mental health, and his depression did start to get a lot more noticeable. We tried to get him into counseling and tried to get him on meds, and he refused to do it. He said, "Mom, if I try to get that help, that means I'm gonna have to admit to myself I'm broken, and I just can't do that." When he and his wife ended up splitting up, it was really, really hard on him.
Hi. I hope you can help. I'm looking for my son.
We had no idea where he went. As a family, we were trying everything we could to try to find him. We would try to, contact him through email or Messenger on Facebook, but he pretty much literally dropped off the face of the earth for us. Every day, there's always that constant fear that something was going to happen to him.
What is the address of your emergency?
Well, I'm on the fourth floor. I went down there and some guy was putting a blanket over her body, and it's still there. And the body never moved.
Okay, 1 second for me here.
I heard just yelling, "Stop, stop!" You guys gotta come. This guy's not moving.
All right, the officer should be arriving any minute now, okay?
The responding officers, they found the victim down on the sidewalk.
Unresponsive, get EMS rolling.
He had severe trauma to his head and face. He was having difficulty breathing.
He was identified by an ID that was in his pocket. The victim was James Tony Wise. Tony Wise was transferred to the hospital. Arrived around 7:30 in the morning. At this time, officers had the scene taped off, trying to separate witnesses and preserving the crime scene.
When we arrived, we filmed crime scenes to capture and document the evidence.
There was an opening to a fence to a parking lot. That's where Tony Wise was located.
This must be where the assault took place.
There was a pool of blood. I saw some other items that were kind of strewed up on the ground. There was a metal scooter, pink pepper spray. There was a tent that was kind of smashed down to the ground.
Did you know Tony Wise? Okay.
We had spoken to a witness out at the scene who told us they were familiar with Tony Wise. That witness identified his tent and said that he had been in that area for some time.
Take this out over here.
We were able to see that there were shoe impressions on the tent that appeared to be in blood.
If we could locate that shoe, that was potentially going to be a key piece of evidence for us down the road.
It definitely stood out as something that was a pretty violent attack. We were wondering what could have been the motive to what happened.
Detectives contact Marcus Dayton, the 911 caller who witnessed the attack from his apartment.
This is Detective Greenlee with the Portland Police Bureau. Thanks for taking my call. So if you can just kind of start from the beginning, you were in your residence there?
It's 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'm on that side of the street, my window.
Marcus Dayton looked down to the street below his unit, out to 3rd Avenue.
And all of a sudden I see this guy like lifting himself off the fence and then coming down with his leg, you know, stomping on something.
He sees the suspect hitting and kicking what he thought initially was maybe a bag of trash, but this person was using the fence and stomping another person's head extremely violently.
The guy that you see, let's describe him.
Let's say about 5'10", 5'11".
How much does he weigh?
170, 180 pounds.
He gave a very good description of the clothing that was unique.
He had white pants on, and he had a black sweatshirt, jogging shirt, and it had red markings on either side.
He also described him as having white shoes.
There's probably blood on his shoe from stomping the guy's head to the freaking ground.
After the assault ended, he observed the suspect walking southbound on Northwest 3rd Avenue, where he loses sight of the suspect. This person was definitely a danger to the public, and we needed to locate and arrest this person as soon as we can.
Investigators enlist forensic evidence technician Mark Weber to find cameras that might show the attack.
I went to the ODOT building, Oregon Department of Transportation, to get video. They have a lot of exterior cameras that help cover the streets in that area. The building itself is 1 block directly east of the crime scene. There was one camera angle on the ODOT building that pointed straight across that parking lot, right in the area where Tony's tent was. I was hoping it could show the crime scene and show the attack.
Officer Weber brings the footage to the police bureau for analysis.
Let's see what we got.
This view, which covers this entire parking lot, but it's so far away, you're gonna watch it as carefully as you can.
This looks like the area where Mr. Wise was attacked. Let's go to 4 a.m. just before the 911 call.
So looking at the frame, I'm really focusing right around Mr. Wise's tent in the area where I know the pool of blood was located.
Wait, who's that?
I see a figure walk towards the direction of where Mr. Wise's tent was. And then I also see another figure also come into frame as well. And it looks like then the two figures kind of interact.
Something's happening.
It looked like there was a physical altercation that occurred between the two persons. And at one point in time, a person is knocked to the ground. The suspect continued to kick and punch while the victim was on the ground. Unfortunately, now there's a tree that kind of blocks some of the view.
Replay it.
The 911 caller describes this subject to be wearing lighter colored pants and a darker colored top.
There's light pants. That's gotta be our suspect.
And that's Tony Wise.
The video shows the interaction between the suspect and the victim, and it actually kind of seconds what we heard from witnesses.
It looks like the altercation happens rather quickly. You could tell the fight was a violent fight just based on the person getting knocked down. It appeared that there was only 2 people involved. The biggest drawback about this camera was that it was from far away. It was hard to positively ID the people.
investigators search for surveillance cameras that are closer to the crime scene.
We should be able to find him on other video for the projected time of our homicide.
The attack happened in front of the Blanchet house. There's one camera on the building pointed north. And there was one camera pointed south.
Investigators analyze the footage from both cameras.
All right, can you start about a half hour for the first 911 call?
The camera angle that we're observing here is facing to the south. To the left is the parking lot that's fenced off, and you only capture the top portion of that.
Zoom in.
We start watching the video at approximately 3:50 a.m. We notice where Mr. Weiss's tent is, that portion is not captured in this camera frame.
But we were hoping that this camera might have captured maybe our suspect coming to the scene.
Wait. Who's that? Who's that?
At approximately 3:56, 20 minutes prior to this incident being called into the police, we observed a subject on the sidewalk.
It does look like he was kind of loitering.
Freeze it there. Zoom in on him.
It's difficult to make out facial characteristics of the person, but he's wearing lighter pants and what appear to be white shoes, which is consistent with the description Marcus Dayton provided us.
Let's try the north camera. A minute or two beforehand, see where he came from.
Good shot of his face. This was during COVID, so he was wearing a face mask at the time.
Okay, keep playing.
We see the suspect. He speaks with someone at the northwest corner of the intersection at Gleason and 3rd Avenue.
Then I could see our suspect walking back southbound towards the direction of our scene,
putting him directly in the path of Mr. Weiss's tent, which is just off camera.
We still don't know who our suspect is, but we have a better idea of his movement throughout the scene to start looking at different cameras in the area.
Detective Clifton. Okay, I see. Okay, thank you. Bye. That was the hospital. It looks like he's not going to make it.
We're notified that Mr. Weiss is not going to survive his injuries.
It was severe skull fractures that Tony Weiss received.
That's his mother's number.
Hello?
I kind of knew right then, before he went any further, that it was something about my son. And it was like having my worst nightmare come true.
Where is he? Okay, thank you.
I needed to be with him to say goodbye as good as I could. When I saw him, I just kept telling him over and over, I love you, son. I love you so much. But he couldn't hear it. At least, I was able to hold his hand and tell him goodbye, and I would see him in another life.
Tony dies from his injuries the following day.
It turns into a homicide investigation at that point. We want to bring justice to the family and know that this person's being held accountable for their actions. Detective Greenlee and I are on scene getting briefings from the responding officers. We learn that another assault had occurred earlier in the morning.
So there was another assault just around the corner.
What?
Yeah.
The officer tells investigators that the assault happened around 2:55 a.m., 80 minutes before the attack on Tony Wise.
It was a block across from where Mr. Weiss had been assaulted.
We don't know if they were connected, but it was definitely odd. It was very similar to the attack on Mr. Wise.
A witness called 911 to report the incident.
911, what is the address of the emergency? I am right in front of the Chinese Garden downtown. There's this man that was like really brutally beat up, and he's like passed out on the side of his car, and he's like really bloody. I don't think he's conscious.
What's the color inside the vehicle?
It's a white Mercedes-Benz.
What stood out to us was the witnesses describing the suspect also kind of kicking and stomping the victim, and the victim also had severe injuries to his face.
The victim of the assault is Tembelani Deniso.
How many people assaulted him?
It was like two guys.
What about the victim?
I learned from Officer Garth that he interviewed the victim, Mr. Deniso, at the hospital.
He couldn't remember any of it.
He was unable to provide much of a statement as to what occurred because of the head injury.
The Mercedes-Benz was currently still located at the scene. So we take a look. We saw a significant amount of blood on the vehicle.
Some of our criminalists document the scene in photographs and collect blood evidence as well.
With Tony Wise and another victim, Mr. Deniso, the similarities stood out. But we just didn't have much information on what could have been the motive connecting these two incidents. Tony Wise was homeless, and now we have another victim with a vehicle, a Mercedes-Benz.
You have a person just randomly assaulting and attacking people downtown. It's very unusual. We start looking for surveillance video cameras in that area that we can capture this assault and see if it matches up with the suspect that we had seen at the Blanchet house. Right at the corner there is the Trailhead Credit Union. We observed the credit union there to have an exterior surveillance camera that we believe captures that intersection and ultimately that first assault.
Investigators review the footage back at the police bureau.
Can you go to 2:30 a.m., see if we can spot the vehicle?
We're looking for a white Mercedes. There's a lot of lighting there, so you can see everything in color. The video doesn't come out grainy.
There was a good camera that picked up the intersection. I'm really looking, can I place Mr. Deniso's vehicle there?
There, that's it.
At 2:42 hours on the camera, we observed Deniso's white Mercedes driving northbound on Northwest 2nd Avenue.
You can see the brake lights illuminate and pull along the west curb line. I'm just trying to understand what led up to this assault that took place at the vehicle.
Who's that?
At about 2:53 hours, I see a person walking, kind of looking at his phone, and he's walking northbound towards the direction of Mr. Deniso's vehicle.
Hang on, who's this? Freeze it there.
The person walking behind is wearing a kind of a darker shirt, but his pants were of a light color, and then wearing white shoes. And that stood out to me. But it also looked like he was carrying an object in his hand that looked like a jacket.
Zoom in on that.
As they walked towards the vehicle, I could see it almost looked like the door was ajar at one point.
It's so far away, you can't see clearly what exactly happens. You can see movement. The one gentleman's white pants, you can see it moving, but you can't really tell what's going on.
We were really looking closely. It looks like there's a physical disturbance, a fight that happens at the vehicle.
That must be the assault. Keep playing it.
They come walking back, facing the cameras with nice bright lights. We get to see everything as they're walking toward us.
Look, he's wearing the jacket.
That's our man.
Looking at what he's wearing, a jacket with the leather along the sides, it was consistent to the attack on Mr. Wise. So I believe this was the same person.
The one gentleman was wearing a mask. We can't really see his face.
Freeze it there. Can you zoom in on the shoes?
You can see blood on his shoes. You can very plainly see it.
I believe this was blood that was from the attack with Mr. Deniso.
This is definitely our guy.
So we have our suspect at 2:59. It's within just a few blocks and an hour and a half before Mr. Weiss is assaulted. And when they walk off to the south, this was also the same direction where Tony Weiss had been murdered.
But there wasn't a clear connection between both the attacks, so we didn't have a clear motive at this time.
Zoom in on the other guy.
This other person that's with our suspect, he's a high priority for us as well at this point to identify.
As officers search for the suspects, investigators meet with Tony's family.
The detective in charge was really nice. He seemed to really care if they found out who did it, which surprised me because a lot of times when somebody's homeless, they don't seem to get any attention.
Can you think of anyone who might have done this to Tony?
Tony's family had no idea who this person is that committed this offense.
We just try to get an understanding of what prompted this attack, kind of the motive behind it.
I want to assure you that we're doing everything we can to find who did this. If you know anything, we'll let you know.
Investigators review additional footage from the Trailhead Credit Union. They trace the suspect's movements following the attack on Mr. Deniso.
At the entrance to the credit union, there's a recessed alcove area where there's a camera.
There he is.
About 3:42, I observed our suspect. He was no longer with the male observed previous with the attack on Mr. Deniso. He was walking towards the ATM machine.
So I bring up that camera.
And I see a white female kind of wearing a pinkish color jacket, almost like a kind of plastic shower cap on her head, and an unknown male. I then see our suspect come into the frame the ATM.
It's nice and clean and crisp, and it lets us see our suspect in full light.
You could really get a clear image of kind of the t-shirt that he's wearing underneath, the jacket, and that he's wearing glasses. We see that they're both interacting like they know each other.
What are they doing?
Seems like they're pushing, trying to get money out of the machine.
At one point, it looks like the female gets frustrated.
Oh.
Then also a moment that the suspect looks like he gets frustrated at the machine as well, and he punches the machine. When he punches the ATM, it seems like he punched the ATM with a lot of force. You could tell that something disturbed him or angered him at this point.
This is maybe 15 minutes before the actual homicide attack at Tony's tent. Is this guy gonna strike somewhere else? We're in a race against time to find this person as quickly as possible.
Looking at the video that we obtained from the Trailer Credit Union, that was probably our clearest image that we had of the suspect. So I did a screen capture, and then I distributed that through police channels, see if they recognized the person as well.
Meanwhile, Connie searches for someone who can tell her about Tony's last days.
The police told me where he had been staying. I wanted so badly to know what was going on with him. Did they know if he was trying to get back in touch with his family?
Did you know my son, Tony Wise? No.
There was somebody that worked at the shelter, and there was a handwritten note in there that said, "Thank you for being who you are. I really appreciate you. You're a good person, and you're my angel." They said it was from one of the other homeless people that they had given to Tony. Tony was living in a shelter and got a job in there. He cared a lot for the people out there. It wouldn't surprise me a bit if somebody just really appreciated him. I would have given anything to have him back.
Investigators traced the suspect's movements after Tony Wise's murder.
Start a little after 4 a.m.
The suspect headed south after he attacked Tony. Detectives review surveillance camera footage from the likely route he walked.
There he is.
I see our suspect walking along Northwest 1st Avenue to a staircase, which will lead up to West Burnside Street.
Freeze it there. Zoom in. His shoes.
You can see the blood on his shoes. It's the same person.
Keep playing.
Then I can see him walking up the staircase.
Bring up the camera in West Burnside.
So then I look at additional cameras that captured West Burnside Street.
There he is.
And I observe the suspect then walk westbound towards the direction of the shoreline.
The shoreline is transitional housing for people that have been released recently from prison.
He appears to enter the front entrance of the shoreline.
I was just like, holy cow, I know where this guy lives.
Investigators send images of the suspect to local parole officers to see if they recognize him.
And we received a call from Multnomah County Probation Officer Paula Feda, who explained to us that she recognized the person as being Elijah Williams.
Yeah. What can you tell me about Elijah?
She explains to us that Elijah Williams was incarcerated for a period of time for sexual assault on a minor. And that he's now living at the shoreline as kind of a transitional housing upon being released.
It all made sense. The shoreline is literally 5 blocks from where Tony Weiss was murdered. On February 19th, we established surveillance at the shoreline. Our plan was to locate Mr. Williams away from the apartment, take him into custody safely, and execute the search warrant at his residence. One of our detectives observed Mr. Williams leave the shoreline. He got on a TriMet bus, and we followed him. And once he was in a position that was safe, we took him into custody. Now we need to understand why this thing happened. We entered Elijah Williams' apartment and we recover this jacket. We recover the pants. We recover the glasses.
We also saw a pair of white shoes. This was very important evidence because we knew now that we had the shoes that were used during the assault. They matched the impressions observed previously on the tent.
DNA confirmation determined that Tony Weiss's DNA was on the shoes. Luminol revealed that there was blood on the carpet at the entryway of Elijah Williams' room. They used luminol on the bathroom sink as well. We're 100% confident that we've got the right guy, that he's the person that's murdered Tony Weiss. Inside the apartment, we located what we believe to be steroids. You hear the phrase roid rage or things of that nature. That might have factored into why he acted the way he did. Elijah Williams is transported back to the detective division, downtown Portland.
First, detectives ask Williams about the assault on Mr. Deniso.
There was a fight. Someone called it in. Early morning hours on the 13th. I was actually one of the ones that was assaulted. You were one of the ones that was assaulted? What happened? A guy stole my friend's phone, and we confronted him about it, and he started attacking me. I did hit him back. You hit him back? I did.
He described that he was more the victim of the attack. But that was kind of the first win in the interview of just placing there on scene. Looking at the video after the attack of Mr. Deniso, see red blood on his shoes, so I don't believe that he was the victim.
And what friend was it that you were with to go confront this guy to get the phone back? My friend Bear. Bear?
He lays out a story where he claims that he's with his friend. We were never able to identify who this person Bear was. We start speaking with Elijah Williams about Tony Weiss, the attack on him.
There was a fight outside of the Blanche house. Yeah, I've seen the area before in the parking lot, but I've never actually been by the Blanche house.
At this point during the interview, he details stuff that we know is not true. The surveillance video puts him at the Blanche house.
You can't really argue over it. The video proves the case.
Video has put you at the fight. What happened when you got over there? I was being loud or whatever. Some dude told me to shut up. He came out with some pepper spray and just started closing me down. And then that's when I ran over to try to go grab it out of his hand. He started grabbing me on my throat and grabbed my jacket. And so I tried to wrestle him for it. And then I threw him on the ground, started kicking him.
Elijah Williams, he ultimately admits his involvement. And we talked to him about the injuries, the significant damage, and just the pure violence of what the assault had done to Tony Weiss.
The male that I showed you in that picture, when he was taken to the hospital, He was treated for very serious injuries.
But he passed away. And so we can't change that.
Don't say that. Don't say that.
He ultimately regretted what he had done. It's easy to walk away from Tony Weiss, to not recognize him as a person, as a human being, because he was a homeless person.
Williams is charged with second-degree murder for killing Tony Wise and second-degree assault for the attack on Tempelani Deniso.
We were able to rule out Bear as having any involvement in the Tony Weiss murder and Deniso assault. We were also able to rule out the female at the ATM as having any involvement in the Tony Weiss murder.
Prosecutors pieced together what happened on the early morning of February 13th.
Elijah Williams, he was taking his testosterone, his steroids, drinking heavily, and decided to go out. He was at a club with a friend, and a friend's phone had been stolen.
Williams tells police that Deniso stole the phone. Williams and Bear catch up with Deniso later in the evening.
Mr. Williams brutally beat Deniso and then left him.
There is no evidence that Deniso stole any property from Williams or his friend Bear.
Elijah Williams encountered some friends, including a woman. When the suspect punches the bank machine, he looks angry and then walked off in the direction where Tony had been living. He was being loud, and now Tony had told them to be quiet. They'd exchanged words, and things quickly escalated. He started stomping Tony's head and beating Tony till the point that Tony was no longer conscious. Then left the Blanchet house area, slowly made his way back to his residence. He had been drinking alcohol with the steroids that resulted in him just flying into a rage and doing what he did unprovoked without any further real explanation for it. Tony was a decent guy, and certainly no one deserved what happened to him.
Elijah Williams pleads guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter in the first degree for the killing of Tony Wise. He also pleads guilty to attempted assault in the second degree for the attack on Tempelani Deniso. The judge sentences him to 17 years in prison.
I am glad that that person is going to be in jail for a long time. I hope he doesn't get out, because I would be fearful for anybody that would be near him.
I hear a lot of people say there is no such thing as closure, but I actually think I did feel some, just because they were able to find the killer and he was brought to justice.
This surveillance video was absolutely crucial in this investigation to solve the case.
Without the video, they probably would have never found the suspect. Plain and simple. It seals the deal. The video will tell the absolute truth.
Tony, maybe he would have at least started to have some kind of a relationship with his children again, and at least see them grow up, see them have, birthdays and do all those, big events in life.
It would have been one of the nicest times of my life, being able to get him back.
Next time on See No Evil.
911.
If I could get an officer to do a welfare check on my mother.
The next steps to take is to obtain that surveillance footage.
It just drew a lot of alarm bells for everybody.
It was hard for me to realize that somebody could do this to another human being.
Let's start from top. Did you kill her?
It started with a door that should have been closed. On a freezing Colorado morning in February 2000, a newspaper delivery driver slowed his car along a quiet suburban street in Aurora, expecting the usual silence of early morning routines, porch lights flickering, frost on windshields, the faint rumble of distant highway traffic. Instead, he noticed something wrong. The front door of a modest two-story house stood slightly open, moving just enough in the wind to tap softly against the frame. Tap. Pause. Tap again. At first it looked ordinary. Maybe someone had stepped out for the paper. But the porch light was still on, glowing pale against the gray sky. The newspapers from the previous day lay untouched beside the steps. And the door was open just wide enough to feel like an invitation, or a warning. Inside that house lived 29-year-old Emily Harper. Emily wasn't the kind of person people expected to vanish into a headline. She worked at a pediatric clinic, volunteered at a local animal shelter, and lived what neighbors later described as quiet but happy. The type of person who waved every morning when she backed her silver Honda Civic out of the driveway. But on that morning, the car was still there. The driver hesitated. Something gnawed at him, the kind of instinct that doesn't come with logic, only a cold tightening in the chest. He stepped out, walked halfway up the driveway, and called toward the open doorway. No answer. Only the faint hum of a television inside. Minutes later, the first patrol car arrived. And within hours, the entire street would become a crime scene wrapped in yellow tape, television trucks lining the curb, neighbors whispering from behind their curtains as a phrase began circulating through the police radios and news broadcasts. Possible missing person. Possible foul play. Possible beginning of what investigators would later call one of Colorado's most disturbing cold cases. Inside the house, everything looked wrong. Not violently wrong. Not the shattered chaos of a break-in. Instead, it was the quiet kind of wrong, the subtle disruption that makes investigators pause. Emily's purse sat on the kitchen counter. Her phone lay beside it. Her car keys rested exactly where they always did, in a small ceramic dish shaped like a sunflower. The television in the living room was still playing a late-night talk show rerun, the laugh track echoing strangely through the empty rooms. But Emily Harper was gone. Detectives walked slowly through the house, documenting everything. No signs of forced entry. No overturned furniture. No broken windows. Just a faint detail that would haunt the investigation for years. A single coffee mug sat on the dining table. 2 chairs were pulled out. One mug half full, the other empty. Someone had been sitting across from Emily the night before. Someone who had walked out of that house. Without her. Neighbors soon began telling investigators the last pieces of normal life they had seen before the mystery began. Emily returning home around 7 p.m. A porch light switching on shortly afterward. Soft music playing through an open window. Nothing that suggested danger. Nothing that suggested that within hours, the entire community would be searching the snow-covered streets for a woman who had simply disappeared. Police canvassed the neighborhood. Did anyone hear shouting? A car leaving late at night? Strange footsteps in the snow. But the answers came back the same. No. 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 It was as if the night had swallowed the truth. Then a detective noticed something small near the back patio door. A set of footprints. Only one direction. Leading away from the house. But there was a problem. The snow had fallen after midnight. Meaning whoever left those prints walked away sometime in the early morning hours long after Emily was last seen alive. By the end of the first day, investigators faced a chilling possibility. Emily hadn't left voluntarily. Someone had taken her, and that someone might have been the last person sitting across from her at that dining table. The search expanded quickly. Police helicopters swept across frozen fields. Volunteers combed drainage ditches and wooded trails. Flyers appeared on telephone poles across Aurora. But the deeper investigators looked into Emily Harper's life, the more unsettling the story became. Because Emily had secrets. Small ones at first glance. A recent breakup. A strange phone call from an unknown number just days before she vanished. And a neighbor who claimed he saw headlights parked outside her house close to midnight from a vehicle no one in the neighborhood recognized. Then came the detail that shifted the entire investigation. Emily's computer. Detectives examining her home office found her email inbox open. The last message she read had arrived at 11:18 p.m. No subject line. Only one sentence. Are you alone tonight? The sender's address led nowhere. A temporary account. Created just hours earlier. Deleted minutes later. Investigators now believed something far darker had unfolded inside that quiet suburban home. Emily Harper hadn't simply vanished. She had been targeted. But by who?
And why?
The case exploded across local news broadcasts. Colorado woman missing. Late-night visitor suspected. Police search for clues. Days passed. Then weeks. The snow melted. The footprints disappeared. And the case slowly transformed into something every detective fears. A mystery with no body. No suspect. No clear story. A cold case waiting to begin. But what investigators didn't know then, what they would only discover years later, was that the night Emily disappeared had left behind something hidden. Something buried quietly inside the evidence. Something that would sit unnoticed for 2 decades before reopening the case. And when that discovery finally surfaced, seasoned detectives would say the same thing. The truth behind Emily Harper's disappearance was far darker than anyone imagined. And it had been hiding in plain sight all along. The first 48 hours of a disappearance are supposed to be the most critical. Detectives know it. Families know it. Every minute that slips away carries the possibility that evidence is fading, witnesses are forgetting, and whoever is responsible is moving further out of reach. In the case of Emily Harper, those first 2 days moved like a storm: sirens, search teams, flashing lights sweeping across quiet streets that had never seen this kind of attention before. Aurora was not the kind of place people expected violence to erupt from the shadows. It was a neighborhood of trimmed lawns and garage sales, of children riding bicycles in the summer and Christmas lights glowing in winter. But now reporters stood on sidewalks with microphones, speaking in hushed voices about a woman who had vanished overnight. Neighbors gathered in small clusters behind police tape, whispering theories that shifted with every new rumor. Someone must have forced their way in. Maybe it was a burglary gone wrong. Maybe she ran away. But investigators inside the house knew something the public did not. This wasn't random. The dining table told a story. 2 mugs, 2 chairs, and a faint circular stain where a third object had once sat, something that had been removed before police arrived. A detective crouched near the table, running a flashlight beam across the surface. The wood caught the light just enough to reveal the outline.
Small.
Roughly the size of a glass. Whatever had been sitting there had been taken. That meant the person who left the house had not rushed. They had time. Time to notice what might connect them to the scene. Time to remove something important. And that detail sent a quiet ripple through the investigation. Because criminals who panic make mistakes. Criminals who stay calm are something else entirely. Outside, search teams expanded their radius mile by mile. Dogs tracked Emily's scent from the front door down the sidewalk, past the mailbox, and toward the street, then suddenly lost it. Right at the curb. The handler knelt beside the dog, studying the snow. There were tire marks. Fresh ones. Investigators photographed them immediately, measuring the width of the tracks. Not enough to identify a specific vehicle, but enough to confirm something chilling. A car had stopped outside Emily's house sometime during the night. And whoever had been inside the house likely left in that vehicle. That theory gained momentum when a neighbor 2 houses down approached detectives with something he had almost dismissed as unimportant. Just after midnight, he said, he had been taking out the trash when he noticed headlights idling near Emily's driveway. He assumed it was a visitor. But now he remembered something strange. The car never pulled into the driveway. It stayed parked on the street. Engine running. Lights off. The neighbor estimated it stayed there for at least 20 minutes before driving away slowly. "Did you see the driver?" a detective asked. The man shook his head. Too dark. Too far. All he remembered was the shape of the vehicle. A dark sedan. Older model. Nothing distinctive. In a city of hundreds of thousands of cars, that description might as well have been smoke. Meanwhile, inside the house, forensic technicians worked methodically through every room. Fingerprints. Fibers. Hair samples. The kitchen sink revealed something else subtle. 2 plates had been washed recently, still sitting in the drying rack. The water spots suggested they had been cleaned late the previous night. Someone had eaten dinner in that house. Someone Emily trusted enough to sit down and share a meal. And then something changed. The living room television continued playing quietly in the background as investigators pieced together the final hours of Emily's life. Her phone records showed a normal evening. Calls from coworkers. A short conversation with her younger sister around 9:30 p.m. Nothing unusual. But at 10:57 p.m., a new number appeared. An incoming call lasting 42 seconds. No voicemail. No message afterward. The number belonged to a prepaid cell phone. Purchased 2 weeks earlier. Paid with cash. And by the time police tried to trace it, the phone had already been disconnected. A disposable voice in the dark. Detectives listened carefully to the timeline forming in front of them. Emily comes home from work. She prepares dinner. Someone arrives at the house. They sit together.
They talk.
Coffee is poured. Then, sometime after midnight, something happens. Something big enough that Emily Harper disappears from her own home without taking her purse, her phone, or her car. And whoever was responsible leaves calmly enough to erase at least one piece of evidence before stepping back out into the night. The more investigators examined the scene, the clearer one fact became. Emily knew the person who came to visit her. There were no signs of fear. No defensive wounds in the house. No overturned chairs. Nothing suggesting a struggle large enough to make noise. It looked like a normal evening right up until the moment it wasn't. By the third day, the search had expanded far beyond Aurora. Police helicopters scanned frozen lakes. Divers checked reservoirs. Teams moved slowly through wooded areas outside the city. Still nothing. Not a jacket. Not a footprint. Not a single trace of Emily Harper. The story began spreading across Colorado television networks. Mysterious disappearance. Late-night visitor suspected. Police ask public for tips.
Tips did come in. Hundreds of them.
Most useless. Someone thought they saw Emily at a gas station 2 towns away. Another caller insisted a white van had been circling the neighborhood days earlier. One anonymous voice claimed Emily had been involved in something dangerous.
Drugs. Debt.
Something darker. Investigators followed every lead. None of them held. But then detectives received a call that made the room go silent. The caller refused to give a name. The voice sounded male.
Low. Calm.
"I think you're looking in the wrong direction," he said. The detective on the line kept his tone steady. "What do you mean?" A pause. Then the voice spoke again. "Look closer to home."
Click.
The call ended. Police traced the number. Another prepaid phone.
Purchased that morning.
Used once. Then discarded. It could have been a prank. Or it could have been something far worse. Because as investigators began looking deeper into Emily Harper's life, into her relationships, her past, her quiet routines, they began noticing small fractures in the story of who she was. Nothing dramatic. Nothing criminal. Just tiny details that didn't fit the image of a perfectly ordinary life. A coworker who mentioned Emily had seemed distracted in the weeks before she vanished. A neighbor who remembered seeing her arguing on the porch with someone weeks earlier. And an entry in Emily's personal calendar on her computer. 3 days before she disappeared. Just 2 words typed into the reminder box. Meet him. No name. No location.
Just that.
Meet him. When detectives saw that note, the investigation shifted again. Because somewhere out there was a man Emily Harper had planned to meet. And the night she vanished, someone had come to her house. The question was simple. Were they the same person? Or had something far more complicated unfolded inside that quiet suburban home while the rest of the neighborhood slept? Detectives didn't know it yet, but buried inside Emily's past was a connection that would slowly pull the investigation in a direction no one expected. A connection that would introduce the first real suspect. And with him, the first truly chilling possibility. Because sometimes the most terrifying truth behind a disappearance is not a stranger lurking in the dark. Sometimes the danger is someone who already knows the way to your front door. By the end of the first week, the quiet suburban street where Emily Harper lived had transformed into something that no one there had ever experienced before. Satellite trucks lined the curb. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind. Reporters stood in front of cameras repeating the same haunting phrase over and over again. Colorado woman missing, police searching for answers. Inside the Aurora Police Department, the investigation had already begun to narrow toward a single uncomfortable truth. Emily hadn't been taken randomly. She had opened the door for someone. That meant whoever walked into her house that night was someone she trusted enough not to question. And that realization forced detectives to look closely at the people closest to her. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, family. Every conversation Emily had in the weeks before she vanished became part of a growing timeline investigators built across an entire wall inside the homicide division. Photographs, phone logs, handwritten notes. Each new detail added another thread to a web that still had no center. But one name appeared repeatedly as detectives combed through Emily's recent life. Daniel Reeves, 32 years old, construction supervisor. And until 3 months before Emily vanished, her boyfriend. Their breakup had not been quiet. Co-workers at the pediatric clinic remembered Emily arriving to work one morning with red eyes and a forced smile. When someone asked if she was okay, she brushed it off with a simple answer. Just a bad night. But over time, small pieces of the story leaked out. The relationship had grown tense. Arguments. Jealousy. Emily had started distancing herself. Then one night in November 1999, she told Daniel it was over. According to friends, he didn't take it well. He said she'd regret it. One coworker later told detectives. Not shouted, not screamed, just said calmly, as if it were a promise. So investigators brought Daniel Reeves in for questioning. He arrived at the station looking tired but composed.
Tall.
Dark hair. The kind of face that could appear either friendly or distant depending on the light. Detectives watched him carefully as they asked the first question everyone already knew the answer to. When was the last time you saw Emily Harper? Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand across his jaw. About a month ago, he said. After the breakup. His voice stayed steady. No hesitation. No visible cracks. He said they hadn't spoken since December. That he had moved on. Started seeing someone else. Focused on work. Detectives slid a photograph across the table. Emily smiling at a barbecue the previous summer. Did you go to her house on February 12th? Daniel shook his head immediately.
No.
Did you call her that night? Another shake of the head.
No.
Did she contact you?
No.
The interview continued for nearly 2 hours. Every answer came smoothly. Too smoothly, some detectives thought. But calm behavior wasn't evidence. And when investigators checked Daniel's alibi, it seemed solid. On the night Emily disappeared, he had been working late at a construction site outside Denver. 3 co-workers confirmed it. Security logs showed his truck leaving the site just after 2 a.m. More than 30 miles away. Not impossible to travel, but difficult. Especially with snow beginning to fall across the region that night. Still, detectives weren't ready to let him go completely. Because another piece of information had surfaced. A neighbor living across from Emily's house remembered something about the car parked outside around midnight. At first, he had only described it as a dark sedan. But after seeing Daniel Reeves' vehicle during a police visit, the neighbor paused. He wasn't sure, but it looked similar. Daniel drove a black 1996 Ford Taurus. A car so common it might as well have been invisible. Thousands of them moved through Colorado streets every day. But the possibility was enough to keep investigators watching him. Meanwhile, the search for Emily continued. Volunteers spread through fields carrying flashlights. Church groups organized prayer vigils. Her face appeared on flyers in grocery stores, gas stations, bus stops. Missing since February 13th. Last seen at home. Call if you know anything. The city watched and waited. But no one called with the answer detectives needed. Instead, the case began revealing something stranger. When police searched Emily's email accounts more thoroughly, they found a short exchange from 2 weeks earlier. A conversation with someone using the name Chris M. The messages were brief. Friendly. Almost casual. But one line stood out. Maybe we should talk in person instead. Emily had replied just a few minutes later. Okay. When? The response came the next day. Soon. After that, nothing. No more messages. No phone number attached. Just silence. Detectives traced the account. It had been created at a public computer inside a Denver library. No identification required. Security cameras in the building were old and low quality. Footage from that day showed dozens of people walking past the terminal. None clearly identifiable. The trail faded again. 2 weeks into the investigation, frustration began creeping into every conversation inside the police department. Detectives replayed the same questions again and again. Who was sitting at Emily's table that night? Who drank from that second mug? And why had they taken something with them when they left? Then a forensic technician returned with a small discovery from the dining table. One of the coffee mugs contained a partial fingerprint. Not Emily's. Not belonging to anyone in the national database either. It was incomplete but clear enough to confirm one thing. There had been someone else in that house. Someone who had sat calmly, drinking coffee, moments before Emily Harper vanished. The print was entered into the system. Weeks passed. No match. The investigation slowed. News crews moved on to other stories. The search teams shrank. And slowly, painfully, the case began to slip into that quiet category every detective fears. Unsolved. But before the file could fully cool, one more piece of information surfaced. A coworker from the clinic remembered something Emily had mentioned just days before she disappeared. A conversation that had seemed unimportant at the time. Emily had laughed about it, said it was probably nothing. But now, hearing about the investigation, the coworker realized it might matter. According to her memory, Emily had received a strange message on her answering machine. A man's voice. Low. Careful. Not threatening. Just unsettling. The message had been short. I know what happened. Emily had deleted it. Told her coworker. She didn't even know who the man was. But now that phrase hung in the air like a shadow. I know what happened. What had happened? What did Emily know? And more importantly, who else knew it too? As detectives dug deeper into Emily Harper's past, they began uncovering a story that stretched further back than anyone expected. Further back than her recent relationships. Further back than her quiet life in Aurora. A story connected to something that happened nearly 10 years earlier. Something that, until that moment, no one had considered relevant. But when investigators opened that old chapter of Emily's life, the case shifted in a way no one could have predicted. Because buried inside that forgotten history was a name. A name that had never appeared in the investigation before. And when detectives read it for the first time, the room went silent. Because that name belonged to someone who had already been connected to violence once before. Someone who had disappeared from Colorado years ago. Someone who, if the pieces fit together the way investigators feared, might have returned. And if that was true, Emily Harper's disappearance might not be a random tragedy at all. It might be the continuation of something far darker that had started long before anyone noticed. A story that had been waiting quietly for 10 years to begin again. The file was old enough that the paper had started to yellow at the edges. It had been buried deep inside an archive drawer at the Aurora Police Department, a case no one had opened in nearly a decade. Dust clung to the corners. The folder label had faded slightly, but the name typed across the tab was still clear. Mark Callahan. Detectives spread the contents across the conference table under the cold glow of fluorescent lights. Photographs. Interview transcripts. A handful of reports written by officers who had long since transferred, retired, or simply moved on with their lives. At first glance, the case had nothing to do with Emily Harper. 10 years earlier, in 1990, Mark Callahan had been the prime suspect in a violent assault outside a Denver bar. A woman had been attacked in the parking lot late at night. She survived, but barely remembered the face of the man who had grabbed her. Witnesses placed Callahan near the scene, but the evidence never held.
No DNA.
No reliable identification.
No arrest.
Eventually, the investigation stalled, and Callahan disappeared from Colorado not long after the accusation surfaced. Some said he moved to Nevada. Others claimed he left the country entirely. Without a warrant or proof, police had no reason to chase him. The case died quietly. Until now. because inside Emily Harper's history was a detail investigators had almost overlooked. In 1990, Emily had been 19 years old, a college student living in Denver. And according to a police interview transcript buried inside that old file, she had been one of the last people to see Mark Callahan the night of the assault. Detectives leaned closer to the document. Emily had been at the same bar that night. She had spoken briefly with Callahan earlier in the evening. Nothing dramatic. Just a conversation at the counter while waiting for drinks. But when the assault happened later that night in the parking lot, detectives questioned everyone who had been inside the bar, Emily included. Her statement back then had been simple. She said Callahan seemed friendly, quiet, a little intense maybe, but not threatening. She left the bar before midnight and never saw him again. The investigators in 1990 had written a note beside her statement. Witness appears credible. And that had been the end of her involvement. Or so everyone thought. Now, 10 years later, Emily Harper had vanished. And somehow her name had resurfaced in connection with a man who once stood at the center of a violent investigation. Detectives stared at the timeline forming in front of them. What if the two stories weren't separate? What if something from that night 10 years ago had followed Emily into the present? The possibility felt distant at first, almost speculative. But when investigators dug deeper into Callahan's past, another unsettling detail emerged. He had returned to Colorado in late 1999, just 2 months before Emily disappeared. The information came from an old driver's license renewal record. Mark Callahan had applied for a new license using a temporary address in Denver. After nearly a decade away, he was suddenly back in the same state, the same city, and only 20 miles from where Emily Harper lived. Detectives quickly began searching for him. The address listed on the license turned out to be a short-term rental apartment. Callahan had stayed there only 3 weeks. Then he was gone again. No forwarding address. No employer listed. Just another quiet disappearance. The timing sent a chill through the investigation team. Emily disappears February 2000. Callahan returns to Colorado December 1999. If the two events were connected, it meant something had brought him back. Something or someone. Investigators started reconstructing every possible link between the two names. Phone records, financial transactions, credit card histories. But Emily's accounts showed nothing connected to Callahan. No calls, no emails, no contact. At least none that appeared on the surface. Then a detective reviewing the evidence from Emily's house noticed something small in the digital records pulled from her computer. An internet search from late January. Just one line typed into a search engine. Mark Callahan, Colorado. The timestamp showed Emily had made the search at 11:42 p.m., nearly 2 weeks before she vanished. The room fell quiet again. Why would Emily suddenly look up a man she hadn't seen in 10 years? Had she recognized the name somewhere? Had he contacted her first? Or had something else happened that made her remember that night from 1990? The discovery raised a new possibility investigators couldn't ignore. Emily may not have been randomly targeted. She may have been looking for someone. Looking for him. That theory gained even more weight when detectives examined Emily's phone records again and noticed a call placed from a public payphone 3 blocks from her house on February 10th, 3 days before she disappeared. The call lasted only 12 seconds. Long enough to leave a message. The payphone stood outside a small convenience store near a highway exit. Security cameras at the store had captured hundreds of customers that day. But when police reviewed the footage around the time of the call, they found something that made their stomachs tighten. A man stood beside the phone wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap pulled low across his face. The camera angle didn't show him clearly, but his height, his build, the shape of his shoulders, all closely resembled the physical description of Mark Callahan from the old police file. The image was grainy, not enough to prove identity, but enough to make investigators feel they were staring directly at the person who might have set the entire chain of events in motion. Then came another unsettling discovery. The prepaid phone that called Emily at 10:57 p.m. the night she disappeared had been activated just hours earlier, at a gas station outside Denver. The surveillance footage from that store was clearer. And when detectives slowed the video frame by frame, the man buying the phone appeared for exactly 2 seconds.
Tall.
Dark hair. Face partially visible. The image wasn't perfect, but the resemblance was undeniable. Mark Callahan. If the identification was correct, it meant something terrifying. A man once connected to violence. A man Emily had encountered 10 years earlier. A man who had returned quietly to Colorado. Now appeared in 2 places directly connected to her disappearance. And yet he was still missing. Police issued a request for information about Callahan across multiple states. No confirmed sightings. No recent employment records. No credit activity. It was as if he had stepped back into Colorado briefly, then vanished again. Meanwhile, the public began hearing whispers about a new suspect in the Emily Harper case. A mysterious man from her past. Someone connected to an old assault investigation. Someone who might have returned with unfinished business. But investigators still didn't know the most important part of the story. Why now? Why after 10 years? Why contact Emily again? And if Callahan had visited her house that night, why had no one seen him leave with her? The questions multiplied. The answers stayed buried. But hidden inside the old 1990 file was one final detail detectives had not noticed yet. A detail that had seemed completely irrelevant at the time. Until now. The assault victim in that parking lot had described something strange about her attacker before she lost consciousness. Just one sentence written at the bottom of the police report. He said he remembered me. At the time, investigators assumed the attacker was delirious.
Confused.
Maybe intoxicated. But now, reading those words again a decade later, detectives felt something colder. Because if Mark Callahan had said the same words to Emily Harper, if he had returned to Colorado believing she remembered something about that night, then Emily's disappearance might not just be connected to an old crime. It might be connected to the one person who could expose the truth about it. And if that was the case, the quiet dinner at Emily's house that February night may not have been a friendly meeting at all. It may have been the moment when a secret buried for 10 years finally caught up with her, and someone decided she could never speak about it again. By the 3rd week of the investigation, the name Mark Callahan had begun circulating quietly through the halls of the Aurora Police Department like a shadow no one could quite catch. Every detective working the Emily Harper case knew it. Every lead seemed to circle back toward him. And yet the man himself remained just out of reach. No confirmed address. No current job. No driver's license activity after the renewal. No credit cards. It was as if he had stepped back into Colorado long enough to brush against Emily's life and then slipped away again before anyone noticed. But investigators kept digging. And slowly, the story surrounding Callahan began to take shape. He had grown up in Colorado Springs. A quiet kid, according to school records. Average grades. No criminal history as a teenager. Nothing that predicted violence. But things changed in his 20s. He worked a series of temporary construction jobs across the state, drifting from city to city, rarely staying in one place longer than a few months. Coworkers described him the same way almost every time. Quiet. Polite. Difficult to know. One man who worked with him in 1989 remembered something else. Callahan had an unusual habit of watching people. Not staring aggressively, just observing. Sitting silently during lunch breaks, studying the way coworkers talked, laughed, argued. It made some people uneasy. But there was never any evidence of wrongdoing. Until the assault in 1990. That night outside the Denver bar had changed everything. For weeks after the attack, detectives focused almost entirely on Callahan. He matched the physical description. He had been seen speaking with the victim earlier. But when the case collapsed due to lack of evidence, something else happened. Callahan left. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. He simply stopped showing up at work one day. His apartment was empty when the landlord checked. No forwarding address. No explanation. Just gone. For 10 years. Now investigators in 2000 were trying to answer a question that had grown more urgent with every passing day since Emily Harper disappeared. Why had he come back? And why had Emily searched his name online just 2 weeks before she vanished? The detectives returned to her computer again, combing through every file, every email, every scrap of digital history they could recover. At first it looked like the search had been random, just one line in a search engine. But when a forensic technician examined the browser cache more closely, he discovered something else. Emily had visited an online newspaper archive the same night. And inside that archive was an article published in 1990. The headline read, "Denver woman attacked in parking lot, suspect questioned." The article mentioned Mark Callahan by name. And buried halfway through the piece was another name. The victim, Laura Bennett. Detectives stared at the screen. Because Laura Bennett had moved out of Colorado shortly after the assault. She had relocated to Oregon.
New job.
New life. And according to the last police note in the old file, she had never wanted to speak about the incident again. But now Emily Harper had been reading about it. Late at night, 10 years later. The question was immediate.
Why?
Had someone contacted her about the case? Had she discovered something new? Or had the memory of that night suddenly resurfaced for reasons no one yet understood? Detectives tracked down Laura Bennett in Oregon. She agreed to speak with investigators over the phone, though her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent a decade trying not to remember something painful. When detectives asked about Emily Harper, there was a long pause. "Yes," Laura finally said. "I remember her." Emily had been one of the people detectives interviewed in the bar after the assault. They had spoken briefly that night. Just a few words. Nothing personal. Laura said she barely knew her. But then the detective asked the question that changed the tone of the conversation. "Did Emily ever contact you again after that night?" Silence filled the line. Then Laura answered quietly. "Yes." The call had come 3 weeks earlier. Out of nowhere. Laura said she almost didn't recognize the name at first. But Emily explained who she was. The college student from the bar in 1990. The one who had spoken to detectives afterward. Laura remembered the conversation clearly because it had unsettled her. Emily had asked something strange. She wanted to know if Laura remembered anything else about the man who attacked her. Anything that might not have seemed important at the time. Laura told detectives she didn't understand why Emily was asking. 10 years had passed. The case was over. But Emily insisted. Her voice sounded nervous. Almost urgent. She said she thought she saw him again. Laura told the detectives. The room inside the Aurora police station fell quiet when that sentence was relayed. Emily Harper believed she had seen Mark Callahan. Somewhere in Colorado. Just weeks before she vanished. The implication sent a chill through the investigation. If Emily had recognized him, if she had contacted the assault victim to ask questions, then there was a terrifying possibility. Callahan may have realized she remembered him too. Detectives now looked back at the timeline with a new perspective. Emily searches his name online. Emily calls Laura Bennett asking about the attack. Then 3 days later, someone leaves a message on Emily's answering machine. "I know what happened." The pattern was starting to feel less like coincidence and more like a chain reaction. A quiet suburban woman begins asking questions about a violent incident from 10 years earlier. The suspected attacker returns to the same state. Then suddenly Emily Harper disappears from her own home after sharing coffee with an unknown visitor. The pieces were aligning into something investigators couldn't ignore anymore. But there was still a critical gap in the story. No proof Callahan had entered Emily's house. No proof he had been the man sitting at her table. No proof he had taken her. And without that proof, the case remained suspended between suspicion and certainty. Then something unexpected happened. A tip arrived from a motel clerk in northern Colorado. The woman had been watching television coverage of the Emily Harper case when a photograph flashed briefly on the screen. A reconstruction image of Mark Callahan. The clerk said the face looked familiar. Very familiar. She believed the man had checked into her motel less than 2 weeks earlier. Under a different name. The motel sat just outside Fort Collins, nearly 70 miles from Emily's house. Police rushed to the location immediately. The registration card listed the name, Michael Carter. Paid in cash. 3 nights. Room 17. But when detectives searched the room, the man was long gone. No luggage. No fingerprints left behind. Just a trash can containing something that made investigators pause. A folded newspaper, dated February 12th, the day before Emily disappeared. And circled in pen on the front page was a small article about a charity fundraiser at a pediatric clinic in Aurora, the same clinic where Emily Harper worked. Someone had been watching her, studying her schedule, tracking her movements. And if the motel clerk was right, that someone may have been Mark Callahan. But another question began to grow inside the investigation. A question that made the case even more disturbing. If Callahan had planned to confront Emily, why meet her calmly for coffee inside her house? Why sit across the table from her? Why stay long enough to wash dishes afterward? The behavior suggested something different from a sudden attack. Something more controlled, almost conversational. And that raised the possibility that the night Emily vanished might not have begun with violence at all. It might have begun with a conversation. A conversation about something that happened 10 years earlier in a dark parking lot outside a Denver bar. A conversation that may have revealed a truth someone had spent a decade trying to hide. And if Emily Harper had remembered something from that night, something the police never discovered, then the man sitting across from her might have realized there was only one way to keep that secret buried forever. By early March 2000, the investigation into Emily Harper's disappearance had reached a point where every new discovery felt both promising and frustrating at the same time. The picture forming around Mark Callahan looked darker with each passing day. He had returned to Colorado. He had likely been watching Emily. He had used prepaid phones and false names. He had stayed in a motel within driving distance of her home. And yet none of it placed him definitively inside that house the night she vanished. Detectives needed something stronger. Something undeniable. And that meant going back to the evidence collected from the beginning. Every photograph. Every fingerprint. Every trace lifted from Emily's home. The forensic lab in Denver reopened the dining room evidence first. The 2 coffee mugs. The plates. The utensils. Anything that might hold DNA. In 2000, forensic science was advancing quickly, but it still wasn't as powerful as the tools investigators would have years later. Even so, technicians carefully extracted what they could. Emily's fingerprints were everywhere. On the mug she drank from. On the table. On the cabinet handles. But on the second mug, the one believed to belong to the visitor, there were only 2 partial prints and a faint smear that might have come from someone wiping the surface. The partial fingerprint investigators had already discovered still sat in the national database without a match. No criminal record. No identification. Just a ghost print from a man who had apparently sat comfortably inside Emily's house. The plates told a similar story. Emily's DNA. And traces from another person. But the sample was incomplete. Not enough to build a profile strong enough for comparison. For the detectives working the case, it was like standing in front of a locked door with the key just out of reach. The evidence suggested someone had been there, but it refused to reveal who. Meanwhile, the investigation into Mark Callahan continued moving forward in small, uneasy steps. Police released his photo publicly for the first time. The image came from his driver's license renewal in December 1999. Local news stations began broadcasting it during evening reports. Police want to question this man in connection with the disappearance of Aurora resident Emily Harper. The wording was careful. They never called him a suspect. But the implication was clear. Somewhere in Colorado, or perhaps far beyond it, a man named Mark Callahan might be the last person to know what happened to Emily Harper.
Tips flooded in.
Sightings in grocery stores. Sightings at gas stations. One caller even claimed Callahan had been seen boarding a bus headed for New Mexico. Each lead was investigated. Each one collapsed. The sightings were either mistaken identity or dead ends. It was as if Callahan had evaporated the moment the search for him began. Then investigators made another discovery inside Emily's home that had somehow been overlooked during the chaos of the first week. A small spiral notebook sat in the drawer of her kitchen desk. Most of the pages were filled with grocery lists, reminders, phone numbers. Normal life details. But near the back of the notebook, a different kind of entry appeared. The handwriting looked rushed. Uneven. as if Emily had written it quickly before she forgot something important. The note read, "Call Laura again." Below it was another line. "If it's him, I need proof." Detectives studied the words carefully. Emily had already spoken to Laura Bennett once. That was confirmed. But it appeared she had planned to call her again. And the phrase beneath it sent a chill through the room. If it's him. Emily believed the man she had seen, or heard from, might be Mark Callahan. But she wasn't certain. Not yet. She needed proof. The question investigators now faced was terrifyingly simple. Had she gotten that proof? And if she had she confronted him with it? The theory grew stronger when detectives returned to the answering machine tape recovered from Emily's house. The machine had recorded every incoming message automatically. Most were ordinary. Friends. Work calls. Family checking in. But one message stood out. The same message the coworker had mentioned earlier. The voice that said, "I know what happened." For weeks, investigators had replayed the recording again and again, trying to isolate details. Background noise. Accent. Anything. Now, with the possibility of Callahan looming larger than ever, they listened again. This time focusing on the tone of the voice. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't loud. In fact, the man sounded strangely calm, almost conversational, as if he expected Emily to understand exactly what he meant. The message lasted only 4 seconds. Then silence. But there was something else. A faint sound behind the voice. At first it sounded like static. But when technicians enhanced the recording, they identified it. Wind. Strong wind. And something metallic clanking faintly in the background, like a loose chain or sign moving in the breeze. Detectives began searching for locations near Emily's house that might produce that sound. Construction sites. Industrial yards. Empty lots. The investigation expanded again. Days later, a patrol officer reported something unusual at a small abandoned warehouse near the edge of Aurora. The building had been empty for years, but behind it stood an old chain-link gate hanging loose from its hinges. When the wind pushed against it, the metal rattled sharply. Clink, clink, clink. Exactly like the sound on the answering machine recording. The warehouse sat less than 2 miles from Emily's house. Police searched the property carefully. Inside the building they found little more than dust, broken windows, and graffiti. But outside, near the gate, a detective noticed tire tracks pressed into the frozen dirt. Older tracks, partially erased by snow, still visible enough to measure. The width of the tracks matched something investigators had already documented once before. The tire marks found at the curb outside Emily's home. The pattern wasn't unique, but it was similar enough to make the detectives feel a familiar tightening in their stomachs. Someone had been at the warehouse recently. Someone driving the same type of vehicle that may have stopped outside Emily's house. And if that person had used the location to call her, it meant he had been watching her from nearby. Close enough to see her house. Close enough to approach it. Close enough to walk through the front door, if she allowed it. But as investigators combed through the abandoned building, they uncovered something else. Something that hadn't been there long. A cigarette butt, still partially preserved in the snow beside the fence. The brand was uncommon. Imported. When detectives checked Mark Callahan's old police records from 1990, they found a small detail buried in the notes of one officer's report. Callahan had smoked the same brand during his interview. It wasn't proof, but it was another thread pulling the investigation toward the same man. The same shadow that kept appearing just out of reach. And yet the most disturbing part of the story was still forming quietly beneath the surface. Because if Mark Callahan had truly returned to confront Emily Harper, if he had called her, if he had visited her house, then there was one question investigators still couldn't answer. Why had Emily let him inside? The man had once been connected to a brutal assault. Emily had clearly grown suspicious of him again. She had even written in her notebook that she needed proof. So when he arrived at her door that night, why didn't she refuse? Why didn't she call the police? Why did she sit down calmly and share coffee with him instead? The answer might lie in something detectives had not yet considered. Something hidden inside the events of that night 10 years earlier. Because if Emily Harper remembered more about the 1990 attack than she originally told police, if she had kept a secret all those years, then the man sitting across from her at the dining table might not have come to threaten her. He might have come because she had asked him to. And if that was true, the final conversation inside Emily's house may have begun with a single dangerous sentence. A sentence that could change everything both of them thought they knew about that night in 1990. 10 years is a long time for a memory to stay buried. People forget faces. They forget details. They convince themselves that moments from the past weren't as important as they once felt. But sometimes something small cracks the surface. A familiar voice. A passing face in a crowd. A name in a newspaper article. And suddenly the past comes rushing back with a clarity that feels almost violent. Detectives began to believe that something like that had happened to Emily Harper. Because the more they studied the timeline of the weeks before she vanished, the clearer it became that Emily had been quietly digging into the past. Her internet searches. Her phone call to Laura Bennett. The note in her kitchen notebook. If it's him, I need proof. That sentence didn't sound like someone who had simply remembered an old acquaintance. It sounded like someone who had begun to suspect something far more serious. Something connected to that night in 1990. So investigators reopened the old case file completely. Every interview, every witness statement, every detail that had once seemed unimportant. And buried inside those records was a conversation Emily had with police that no one had paid much attention to at the time. The interview transcript from February 1990 was only 3 pages long. Emily had been 19, a college student working part-time while taking classes in Denver. She told detectives she had arrived at the bar around 9:30 p.m. with 2 friends. The place had been crowded, music loud, people packed shoulder to shoulder around the counter. Emily said she had stepped away from her friends at one point to order another drink. That's when she noticed the man standing beside her, Mark Callahan. According to her statement, the conversation between them lasted less than 5 minutes. He asked if the bar was always that busy. She laughed and said it depended on the night. He asked if she went there often. She said sometimes. Then her drink arrived. She returned to her friends. That was the entire interaction. Or, at least, that was what the official transcript suggested. But one detective reading through the report again noticed a handwritten note scribbled in the margin by the officer who conducted the interview. The note was easy to miss. Just one line. Witness hesitated before answering question about parking lot. That observation had never been expanded. No follow-up. No explanation. At the time, investigators probably assumed Emily had simply been nervous. But now the hesitation felt significant. Because the attack on Laura Bennett had taken place in the parking lot behind the bar, just minutes after she left the building. And Emily had left the bar around the same time. Detectives suddenly began asking a question that had never been considered before. What if Emily had seen something that night? Something she hadn't told police. Something she had kept to herself for 10 years. If that was true, it could explain everything. Why she searched for Mark Callahan's name. Why she contacted Laura Bennett. Why she wrote in her notebook that she needed proof. And why, when the man finally appeared again in Colorado, she may have decided to confront him herself. The theory gained momentum when investigators spoke again with Emily's closest friend, Rachel Donovan. Rachel had known Emily since college. They had shared apartments, celebrated birthdays, gone through breakups together. If Emily had been worried about something, Rachel would have noticed. When detectives asked if Emily had mentioned the name Mark Callahan recently, Rachel frowned. Then slowly nodded. Yes, she said. It was about 2 weeks before she disappeared. Rachel remembered the conversation clearly because Emily had seemed unusually quiet that evening. They were sitting in Emily's living room watching television when Emily suddenly muted the volume. Then she asked a question that seemed to come out of nowhere. Do you remember that story I told you about the bar in Denver, the one where that woman got attacked? Rachel vaguely remembered it. Emily had mentioned it once years earlier. A frightening incident from her college days. But Emily had never talked about it much. That night, however, she looked unsettled. Almost distracted. Rachel remembered asking her why she was thinking about it now. Emily hesitated before answering. Then she said, "Something strange. I think I might have seen the guy." Rachel thought Emily meant back in 1990. But Emily shook her head. No, recently. She said she had been leaving a grocery store in Aurora when she noticed a man standing near the parking lot entrance. At first, she didn't think much of it. But as she walked past him, something about his face triggered a memory. A face she hadn't thought about in years. She couldn't be certain, but the resemblance was strong enough that it bothered her all the way home. Rachel had asked if Emily planned to report it to the police. Emily shrugged. "I don't even know if it's him." That's when she mentioned looking up the old news articles online, trying to see a picture of Mark Callahan from the past, trying to confirm what her memory was telling her. Rachel told detectives something else about that conversation, something that seemed small at the time, but now felt unsettling. After talking about the grocery store sighting, Emily had said one more thing, something she had never mentioned before. "I might have seen him in the parking lot that night, too." Rachel had looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing. I'm probably remembering it wrong." And she changed the subject. Now detectives replayed that moment in their minds over and over again. Emily believed she might have seen Callahan in the parking lot the night Laura Bennett was attacked. But she never told the police.
Why?
Had she been unsure at the time? Or had something about that night frightened her enough to stay silent? If she had seen him near the victim, it could have strengthened the case against him. It might even have changed the outcome of the investigation. Instead, the case collapsed. Callahan disappeared. And Emily carried that uncertainty for 10 years. Until one day, she thought she saw him again. The possibility created a chilling chain of events. Emily recognizes Callahan in Aurora. Emily researches the old attack. Emily contacts the victim. And somewhere during that process, Callahan becomes aware that she is asking questions. If that was the sequence, the next part of the story becomes much darker. Because a man who had spent 10 years avoiding the consequences of a violent crime might suddenly realize that one person from the past could expose him. One witness. One memory. One conversation with police. And that witness was now living alone in a quiet suburban house. But even with this theory growing stronger, detectives still lacked the one thing that could turn suspicion into proof. They still didn't know what actually happened inside Emily Harper's home the night she disappeared. Then a new witness came forward. A man who lived 3 streets away. He hadn't contacted police earlier because he assumed the detail was meaningless. But after seeing Mark Callahan's face on television, something about the image unsettled him. He called the police station the next morning. And when detectives arrived at his house, he described something that had happened late on the night of February 12th. Around 12:30 a.m., he had been walking his dog along a side street that passed near Emily's neighborhood. As he approached the intersection near her block, he saw a man standing beside a dark sedan parked along the curb. The man wasn't doing anything unusual, just standing there, looking down the street. At the time, the witness assumed the man was waiting for someone. But when the dog walker turned the corner, he briefly passed under a streetlight. And for just a second, the witness saw his face. Not clearly, but clearly enough that when he saw Mark Callahan's photograph on the news days later, something clicked in his memory. "I'm not saying it was definitely him," the man told detectives carefully, "but it looked like him. Standing in the street, less than 100 yards from Emily Harper's house, waiting." If the sighting was accurate, it meant something terrifying. Mark Callahan may have arrived outside Emily's home that night and waited quietly in the darkness before approaching her door. Watching, thinking, preparing for a conversation 10 years in the making. And if Emily had opened that door believing she was finally going to confront the truth about the past, then the 2 people sitting across from each other at that dining table were not strangers. They were the only 2 people in the room who knew exactly what had happened on a cold night in a Denver parking lot 10 years earlier. The only 2 people who understood why that memory had suddenly become dangerous again. And if the wrong words were spoken during that conversation, if Emily revealed something Callahan thought she might tell the police, Then the quiet coffee meeting inside that suburban house may have turned into something far more final. Because sometimes the most dangerous moment in a mystery is not the crime itself. It's the moment just before the truth comes out. As winter slowly began loosening its grip on Colorado, the Emily Harper investigation was already entering the phase detectives dread the most. The phase where momentum begins to fade. The search parties grow smaller. The television cameras disappear. And the people who once followed every development start returning to their normal lives. But inside the Aurora Police Department, the case refused to settle into silence. Because the deeper investigators pushed into the past, the more it felt like the truth had been circling Emily Harper for weeks before she vanished. It had been building quietly,
piece by piece.
A sighting in a grocery store parking lot. A late-night internet search. A phone call to a woman who had tried for 10 years to forget the worst night of her life. Emily hadn't just remembered the past. She had been chasing it. And now detectives believed that chase may have brought the past straight to her front door. The witness who claimed to see Mark Callahan standing near Emily's street around midnight had changed the tone of the investigation completely. Because if the sighting was accurate, then the timeline now looked disturbingly precise. Callahan arrives near Emily's house.
He waits.
At some point, Emily lets him inside. They sit at the dining table. Coffee is poured. A conversation begins. Then, sometime after midnight, Emily disappears.
But there was still a problem with that theory.
A major one. No one had seen Emily leave the house. Not walking. Not struggling. Not being forced into a car. Nothing. And the snow that began falling after midnight should have preserved at least some trace of what happened next. Instead, investigators found only a single set of footprints leaving the house. One person walking away.
Calmly.
Alone. That detail had haunted detectives from the very beginning. Because it meant one of two things. Either Emily had left the house before the snow began falling. Or she never walked out at all. The second possibility was the one no one wanted to say out loud. But it was becoming harder to ignore. If Emily had been harmed inside the house, whoever did it had managed to remove her body without leaving visible evidence behind.
And that required time.
Planning.
Control.
The behavior investigators were seeing in Mark Callahan's movements suggested exactly that kind of careful thinking. But there was still another layer to the mystery that refused to settle. Emily had wanted proof. That much was clear from the note in her kitchen notebook. If it's him, I need proof. What proof could she have been looking for? The answer might lie in the very thing detectives hadn't found yet. A recording. A photograph. A written confession. Something that could confirm Mark Callahan was the man who attacked Laura Bennett in 1990. And if Emily had planned to confront him about that night, she may have tried to capture the truth during their conversation. Investigators returned once again to Emily's house, searching for anything they might have missed. This time they examined her home office in microscopic detail. Her desk. Her computer. Every drawer. Inside the bottom drawer they discovered something new. A small handheld tape recorder. The kind journalists sometimes used for interviews. The device looked ordinary. But when detectives pressed the play button, nothing happened. The tape inside was blank. Or, at least it appeared to be. The rewind button clicked softly as it spun the cassette backward. Then the detective pressed play again. This time a faint sound emerged. Static. Followed by silence. The tape had been partially erased. Someone had recorded over it. Or wiped it. But not completely. Forensic technicians carefully removed the cassette and sent it to a specialized lab. If even a fragment of the original recording remained, they might be able to recover it. The discovery changed the emotional temperature inside the investigation room instantly. Because if Emily had prepared that recorder before meeting someone in her house, it meant she expected a conversation worth documenting. A conversation that might reveal something dangerous. A conversation she might not have wanted anyone else to hear. Days passed while technicians worked to extract audio from the damaged tape. Meanwhile, detectives continued searching for Mark Callahan across multiple states. His photograph circulated through law enforcement networks nationwide. No confirmed sightings.
No arrests.
The man remained invisible. Then the lab called. They had recovered something from the tape. Not much. Just fragments. Broken pieces of audio buried beneath the static. But enough to hear voices. 2 voices. 1 female. 1 male. The recording quality was poor. The voices distorted. But the conversation was unmistakable. The female voice spoke first. "You were there that night." Then a pause. Several seconds of silence. Then the male voice answered.
Low.
Controlled. "I told you you're mistaken." The tape crackled. Static surged across the recording. Then the woman's voice again. This time more intense. "I saw you." Another long silence. Then the male voice returned. "Emily, you don't understand what you think you saw." The detectives listening to the recovered audio felt the room grow colder. Emily. The man on the tape had said her name, which meant the recording had almost certainly been made during the final conversation inside her house. The moment when the past finally collided with the present. But the audio fragment wasn't finished. Another piece emerged from the damaged tape. Emily's voice again. Quieter this time. "If I go to the police." Then the sound cut sharply into static. The rest of the sentence was gone. Erased. The male voice followed a moment later, though the words were barely audible. "You shouldn't do that." Then nothing. The tape dissolved into noise. That was all the lab could recover. Just a few seconds of a conversation that had likely lasted far longer. But those seconds told investigators something critical. Emily had confronted the man sitting across from her. She believed he was responsible for the attack on Laura Bennett. And she had threatened to go to the police. The implications were immediate. If the man on the tape was Mark Callahan, then that conversation may have been the moment everything changed. Because the next thing detectives knew, for certain, was this. Emily Harper never walked out of that house. The fragments of audio spread quickly through the investigation team. Detectives replayed them again and again, trying to analyze the male voice, trying to match its tone with any known recordings of Callahan. But there were none. No previous interrogations. No interviews. Nothing to compare. Which meant the most important voice in the case still belonged to a man who had effectively vanished. And the tape revealed something else equally unsettling. The recording had been partially erased. Someone had deliberately tried to destroy it. That meant after the conversation ended, someone had found the recorder, found the tape, and tried to wipe it clean. The question that followed was chilling. Why erase the recording but leave the recorder behind? If the man responsible had enough time to remove a body, enough time to wash dishes, enough time to leave the house quietly, why not take the tape entirely? Unless something interrupted him. Unless he believed he had erased it completely. Or unless he had been in a hurry to leave for reasons investigators still didn't understand. But the recovered fragments of audio had done something else too. They had transformed the story of Emily Harper's disappearance into something even more disturbing. Because now investigators knew exactly how the final conversation had begun. Emily confronting a man about a crime from 10 years earlier. Emily threatening to expose the truth. What they still didn't know was how that conversation ended. And somewhere out there, the man who had heard those words firsthand might still be the only person who knew the answer. The tape changed everything. For weeks, the investigation into Emily Harper's disappearance had been built on theories, fragments, and suspicions that never quite formed a complete picture. But the damaged cassette recovered from her desk drawer had revealed something investigators could finally hold on to. Emily had confronted someone inside her own home, late at night, and that conversation had turned dangerous the moment she mentioned the police. The fragments of audio were played again and again inside the investigation room. Detectives leaned forward, listening closely to every distortion in the recording, hoping to extract one more word, one more clue hidden beneath the static. But the tape refused to give up anything else. The voices faded. The conversation vanished. And whatever happened next remained locked in silence. Still, the existence of the recording proved something critical. Emily had expected that meeting. She had prepared for it. She had placed the recorder somewhere close enough to capture their conversation at the dining table. Close enough that the microphone picked up their voices clearly. which meant she had planned to confront the man sitting across from her. And she had been prepared for the possibility that the conversation might become evidence. That realization made investigators rethink the events of that night all over again. Because if Emily had invited Mark Callahan into her house with the intention of confronting him about the 1990 assault, then the entire meeting may have started under a fragile layer of calm. Two people sitting quietly. 2 mugs of coffee. A tape recorder running silently somewhere nearby. At first, the conversation might have sounded almost normal, polite, careful, each person measuring the other's words. But the moment Emily said, "If I go to the police," something shifted. Detectives could hear it even in the damaged recording. The air inside the room must have changed instantly. Because if the man sitting across from her was guilty, those words represented the one outcome he could not allow. Investigators believed that moment, those few seconds captured on tape, may have been the point where the evening crossed from conversation into something far darker. But there was still a question hanging over the case that refused to go away. If the confrontation happened inside the house, how had the person responsible managed to remove Emily without leaving obvious evidence behind? The house had been searched repeatedly. Every floorboard, every closet, every inch of the basement. Nothing suggested a violent struggle large enough to explain a disappearance, which meant whatever happened had likely unfolded quickly and quietly. That theory gained new weight when detectives examined the house's layout more carefully. Emily's dining room sat only a few feet from the back patio door, a sliding glass door that opened directly into the small fenced yard behind the house. The same door investigators had noticed earlier during the first search. The same door where a faint set of footprints had once been found in the snow. Footprints leading away, but never returning. At the time, detectives assumed the footprints belonged to the visitor leaving after the crime. Now, they considered another possibility. What if those footprints were made while the man was moving something?
Someone.
If Emily had been carried out through the patio door before the heavier snowfall began, the tracks could have been partially covered before investigators arrived. The idea was grim, but it fit the timeline. Still, another problem remained. Neighbors. The houses in Emily's neighborhood sat fairly close together. A person carrying an unconscious or injured woman through a backyard risked being seen, unless the person responsible had chosen a moment when no one was watching, or unless they had something else that made the task easier. A vehicle. Detectives revisited the tire marks found near the curb outside Emily's house. The measurements had been recorded carefully in the early hours of the investigation. At the time, the marks seemed too generic to identify a specific car. But now investigators began comparing them against vehicles known to belong to people connected with the case. One match stood out immediately. The track with closely matched the tires used on a mid-1990s Ford Taurus. The same model driven by Daniel Reeves, Emily's former boyfriend. For weeks, Reeves had remained on the edge of the investigation. Interviewed. Checked. Then mostly dismissed because of his alibi. He had been working late at a construction site that night. Co-workers confirmed it. Security logs showed his truck leaving after 2 a.m. But something about the tire measurement forced detectives to take another look at him. Not because they believed he had harmed Emily, but because it raised a different possibility. What if Reeves' car had been seen in the neighborhood earlier and investigators had assumed the vehicle belonged to him? The dog walker who reported seeing a dark sedan near Emily's house had only glimpsed the vehicle briefly. So had the neighbor who saw headlights parked near the curb. Neither witness had identified the driver. If Mark Callahan had been using a similar car, the sightings could easily have been mistaken. The discovery pushed detectives to search deeper into Callahan's movements during the weeks he had spent in Colorado. And that search uncovered something unexpected. During his stay at the Fort Collins Motel, Callahan had briefly rented a car from a small independent rental agency. Paid in cash. 3 days. The rental agreement listed the vehicle type. A black Ford Taurus. The same model Daniel Reeves owned. The same type of car witnesses described seeing near Emily's house. The coincidence sent a cold wave through the investigation. Callahan had not only returned to Colorado quietly. He had chosen a car that blended perfectly into the streets of Aurora. A car so ordinary that no one would look twice, which meant the dark sedan parked outside Emily's house that night might have belonged to him all along. As investigators continued examining the timeline, another disturbing detail emerged. Callahan's rental car had been returned the afternoon after Emily disappeared. The mileage recorded by the rental agency showed the car had traveled nearly 180 miles during those 3 days. More than enough distance to reach Aurora. More than enough to travel somewhere far outside the city afterward.
But where?
Detectives mapped the possible routes. Highways stretching north toward Wyoming, west into the mountains, south across open plains. The possibilities were endless. If Callahan had transported Emily somewhere after leaving her house, he could have reached dozens of remote locations within a few hours. Places where a person could vanish completely. Still, investigators kept returning to the same haunting image. Emily sitting at the dining table, a recorder hidden nearby, a man across from her denying something she believed she saw 10 years earlier. If I go to the police. Those words echoed through the investigation like a ghost, because whatever happened after she spoke them had erased her from the world completely. No body, no trace, no goodbye. Only a silent house with 2 coffee mugs on the table and a partially erased recording that stopped just before the truth could be heard. Months passed, then years. The search areas expanded again and again. Fields, reservoirs, forest trails. Nothing. Eventually, the case that once dominated Colorado news broadcasts slipped quietly into a different category. Unsolved. But the file never truly closed. Because the more investigators looked at the evidence, the more one possibility continued to haunt them. If Mark Callahan had returned to confront Emily Harper and if that confrontation ended with her disappearance, then somewhere out there existed one final piece of the story. A place. A moment. A decision made in the darkness after that tape recorder stopped capturing sound. And the man who made that decision had vanished almost as completely as Emily herself. Which meant the truth behind that cold February night might still be walking somewhere in the world. Unrecognized. Unseen. Carrying the only full memory of what really happened inside that quiet suburban house. By the time summer arrived in Colorado, the Emily Harper investigation had already begun slipping into the slow, grinding rhythm that defines every unsolved disappearance. At first the case had moved like a storm. Helicopters sweeping the sky. Police cars racing down quiet streets. Search teams moving across frozen ground in tight lines, scanning for anything that might break the mystery open. But storms eventually fade. And when they do, what remains is something colder. Silence. Inside the Aurora Police Department, Emily's case file had grown thick with reports, photographs, witness interviews, and forensic analyses that seemed to circle endlessly without reaching the one answer everyone needed. Where was she? Detectives had come to believe that Mark Callahan was the man who sat across from Emily that night. The damaged tape suggested it. The rental car placed him near Aurora. The motel clerk remembered his face. The witness described a man matching his build standing near Emily Street shortly before midnight. All of it pointed in the same direction. And yet none of it could place him inside the house with absolute certainty. No clear fingerprints. No DNA match. No confession. Just fragments of a story that ended abruptly the moment Emily threatened to go to the police. If I go to the police. Those words had become the center of the investigation. The moment where everything likely changed. Detectives often imagine the scene that followed. Emily sitting at the table. Her voice steady, but tense. Callahan realizing that the woman in front of him might expose the truth about a violent crime he had escaped 10 years earlier. Perhaps there was an argument. Perhaps he tried to convince her she was wrong. Perhaps the conversation escalated slowly, quietly, until one moment tipped everything over the edge. But imagination could only go so far. Without evidence, those possibilities remained only theories. And while detectives searched for answers, another strange detail emerged from the timeline of Callahan's disappearance. After returning the rental car the afternoon following Emily's vanishing, he seemed to disappear from the state entirely. The motel in Fort Collins never saw him again. No new driver's license records appeared. No bank accounts surfaced under his name. No confirmed sightings. It was as if the man had simply dissolved into the background of the country. But months later, a call came into the Aurora Police Department from a sheriff's office in western Kansas. The deputy on the line sounded uncertain. He said a man matching Mark Callahan's description had been detained briefly during a traffic stop near a small town outside Dodge City. The man had been driving a used pickup truck. When the deputy ran his identification, the name listed on the driver's license came back as Thomas Keller. But something about the man's face looked familiar. The deputy couldn't place it at first. Then he remembered seeing the image on a television broadcast about Emily Harper. By the time the deputy tried to ask more questions, the man had already been released. The license appeared valid. No warrants were attached to the name. Nothing legally justified holding him longer. And by the time the deputy contacted Aurora investigators, the man was long gone. The pickup truck had disappeared somewhere along a network of rural highways stretching across the plains. It was never located again. Detectives tried to verify whether the man stopped in Kansas had truly been Callahan. But the evidence remained frustratingly thin. The deputy hadn't taken a photograph. The license had belonged to a real person named Thomas Keller, though investigators later discovered the identity had likely been stolen. Another alias. Another layer of distance between the suspect and the truth. As the months turned into years, the investigation began entering the stage every cold case eventually reaches. The stage where time becomes the enemy. Witness memories fade. Addresses change. People move away. The dog walker who had seen the man near Emily's street relocated to Arizona. The motel clerk in Fort Collins retired. Even some of the detectives who originally worked the case transferred to other departments. But Emily Harper's disappearance never fully left Aurora. Her photograph remained on a board inside the detective bureau. A reminder. A quiet challenge. Because cases like this do something unusual to the people who investigate them. They linger, not because of what is known, but because of what remains just out of reach. Years later, forensic science would advance in ways investigators in 2000 could barely imagine. DNA databases expanded. Digital analysis improved. Cold cases across the country suddenly reopened with new hope. Emily Harper's file was among them. In 2019, detectives pulled the evidence boxes back out of storage. They re-examined the coffee mugs, the plates, the cigarette butt found near the abandoned warehouse, even the damaged cassette tape. New forensic techniques managed to extract a slightly clearer audio fragment from the recording. Only a few seconds longer than before, but enough to reveal something detectives hadn't heard previously. After Emily's voice says, "If I go to the police," the man answers again. The words are faint, almost swallowed by static, but they are unmistakable. "You won't." Then the tape erupts into noise. The final words ever captured from the conversation that may have sealed Emily Harper's fate. Those two words echoed through the reopened investigation with chilling clarity. "You won't." Not a threat shouted in anger. Not a panicked response. Just a quiet certainty. The voice of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. The cold case detectives studying the file decades later came to a conclusion that many of the original investigators had feared all along. Emily Harper likely never left that house alive. But the story did not end there. Because despite years of searching, questioning, and reanalyzing evidence, the one person believed to hold the answer, Mark Callahan, had vanished just as completely as Emily herself. No confirmed death. No confirmed sighting. Just rumors. Unverified reports of a man using different names across several states. A drifter moving through the country's quiet corners. If those rumors were true, it meant the man who may have silenced Emily Harper was still out there somewhere, living a life that had never been connected publicly to the disappearance that shocked a Colorado community in the winter of 2000. And the longer he remained invisible, the heavier the case began to feel. Because every unsolved disappearance carries a question that never stops echoing through the years. Not just what happened, but where. Where did the truth finally land after that night ended? Where did Emily Harper go? And who, somewhere in the world, still remembers the final moments that the damaged tape recorder never captured? The house on South Naples Street still stands. The paint has been redone. The fence replaced. New owners moved in years ago, people who never knew the quiet woman who once lived there, or the February night when police cars lined the street and reporters crowded the sidewalks. To them, it is just another suburban home in Aurora. But for the detectives who work the case, the house has never really returned to normal. Because inside that living room, somewhere between the dining table and the sliding patio door, an entire human life simply disappeared.
No witnesses.
No screams heard by neighbors. No body ever found. Only the faint echo of a conversation captured on a half-erased cassette tape. "You won't." 2 words spoken calmly in response to a threat that someone might go to the police. 2 words that may have been the last thing Emily Harper ever heard. Over the years, the case slowly transformed into what investigators call a true cold case. The evidence boxes moved to storage. The detectives who originally worked the file retired or transferred. But the story never fully faded from Aurora's memory. Every few years, a reporter would revisit it. A short segment on the evening news. A newspaper column asking the same question the city had been asking since 2000. What really happened to Emily Harper? The public fascination never came from spectacle or violence. It came from the unsettling simplicity of the mystery. A woman invites someone into her home. They sit down together. They drink coffee. They talk about something that happened 10 years earlier. Then she disappears completely. And the man investigators believe sat across from her vanishes just as thoroughly. 2 lives erased from the same moment in time. Detectives who reopened the case in later years studied every piece of evidence with fresh eyes. The coffee mugs, the partially erased tape, the tire tracks, the cigarette found near the abandoned warehouse, even the faint fingerprint lifted from the mug that did not belong to Emily. But that fingerprint never matched anyone in the national database. Not in 2000. Not in the decades that followed. The voice on the tape never matched any known recording. The rental car returned by a man using an alias led nowhere. And the possible sighting in Kansas, if it truly had been Mark Callahan, remained the last moment anyone may have seen him alive. Some investigators eventually began asking another unsettling question. What if Callahan had not simply disappeared to avoid capture? What if something else happened after he left Aurora? What if the man who may have silenced Emily Harper also vanished for reasons no one ever discovered? It was a theory no one could prove, but it lingered quietly at the edge of the case. Because if Callahan had continued moving across the country under false names, eventually he would have aged, changed appearance, perhaps died somewhere without anyone connecting the identity back to the man investigators were searching for. Or perhaps he succeeded in doing exactly what he seemed to have practiced for years, blending into the background of ordinary life. But the possibility that haunts many detectives the most is simpler than any complicated theory. The possibility that the truth was never far away at all. That somewhere within driving distance of Aurora lies a place where the events of that night truly ended. A stretch of open land. A remote patch of forest. A forgotten roadside ditch. Places where the wind moves across the ground, and no one looks closely enough to see what might still be hidden there. Because if Emily Harper's body was taken from that house in the early hours of February 13th, 2000, it had to go somewhere. And somewhere out there may still hold the only physical proof of what happened inside that dining room after the tape recorder stopped capturing sound. Occasionally, investigators revisit the case, hoping new technology will reveal something the original detectives could not see. Perhaps one day the fingerprint will match a name. Perhaps a forgotten witness will remember something small but crucial. Perhaps a routine DNA search will finally connect Mark Callahan to another crime somewhere else in the country. Cold cases have been solved after 30 years, 40 years, even longer. But until that moment arrives, the story of Emily Harper remains suspended in time. A quiet suburban night. 2 people sitting across from each other at a table. A conversation about a violent memory buried for 10 years. A recorder capturing the first seconds of the truth and then falling silent just before the ending. Somewhere between those moments lies the answer investigators have been chasing for decades. What happened after Emily Harper said she might go to the police? What decision was made in the silence that followed? And what became of the man who answered her with quiet certainty? You won't. In Aurora, the street where Emily once lived still looks peaceful at night. Porch lights glow softly. Cars pass occasionally along the quiet road. Nothing about it suggests that a mystery still lingers there. But for the people who remember the story, every detail of that February night still feels unfinished. Because somewhere out there, whether hidden in memory, buried beneath the ground, or carried silently by the only person who knows the full truth, exists the final chapter of what happened inside that house. A chapter that has never been written. And until it is, the disappearance of Emily Harper will remain exactly what investigators first called it all those years ago. A chilling Colorado cold case. For years, the file sat untouched in a climate-controlled evidence room. A gray cardboard box labeled simply, Harper Emily, missing/possible homicide, 2000. Dust collected along its edges. Paperwork yellowed. Old cassette tapes remained sealed in plastic evidence sleeves. To most people in the department, it was just another unresolved case among hundreds. But in 2023, something changed. A newly formed cold case unit inside the Aurora Police Department began reviewing unsolved investigations from the late 1990s and early 2000s. The team included younger detectives trained in modern forensic technology, tools that simply did not exist when Emily Harper disappeared. One of those detectives, Detective Laura Mendez, pulled the Harper file almost by chance. At first glance, the case seemed familiar. Missing woman. Possible suspect who vanished. No body. Limited physical evidence. But one detail immediately caught her attention. The fingerprint. The partial print lifted from the coffee mug across from Emily Harper had never matched anyone in national databases. Back in 2000, the FBI's automated fingerprint identification system was far smaller than it is today. Millions of prints have been added since then from arrests, military records, immigration databases, and other law enforcement agencies. Detective Mendez wondered if the print had ever been resubmitted. The answer surprised her. It hadn't. Not once. The original detectives had entered the print into the system in 2000, but no one had ever rerun it through the expanded national databases that now existed decades later. So Mendez requested a new analysis. The fingerprint was scanned again using updated imaging software. The digital file was uploaded. Then the system began searching through millions upon millions of records. Hours passed. Then days. Finally, a notification appeared in the cold case unit system. Possible match identified. The name attached to the match stunned investigators. Not Mark Callahan. Instead, the fingerprint belonged to a man named Daniel Reese. Reese had been arrested in Missouri in 2015 for an unrelated fraud charge. During booking, his fingerprints had been taken and added to the national database. That was the first time his prints ever existed in the system. Which meant when detectives in Aurora ran the mug fingerprint back in 2000, there had been nothing to match it against. But now there was. Detectives began digging into Daniel Reese's background. The deeper they looked, the stranger the story became. Reese had lived under at least 3 different names over the years. He had worked short-term jobs across multiple states, Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Arkansas. And according to employment records, he had once worked as a mechanic in Aurora, Colorado in the late 1990s, right around the time Mark Callahan disappeared. The timeline sent a chill through the cold case unit. Investigators quickly located Reese's most recent known address in Missouri. But when they contacted local authorities, they discovered something unexpected. Daniel Reese had died 2 years earlier, in 2021. According to medical records, he passed away in a small rural hospital after a sudden heart attack. No criminal investigations. No suspicious circumstances. He had simply died quietly at the age of 63. Detectives requested his archived records. Driver's license photos. employment files, old addresses. And when they compared those photos to the images of Mark Callahan taken in the late 1980s, the resemblance was impossible to ignore. Different haircut, older face, but the bone structure was strikingly similar. It raised a possibility investigators had never seriously considered before. What if Mark Callahan had never disappeared at all? What if he had simply changed his identity and lived the rest of his life under a new name? The fingerprints suggested exactly that. If Daniel Reese and Mark Callahan were the same man, it meant the primary suspect in Emily Harper's disappearance had been alive for more than 2 decades after the crime.
Working ordinary jobs.
Living in quiet towns. Blending into everyday life. And then dying before investigators ever discovered the connection. But the discovery also raised an even darker question. If Daniel Reese truly was Mark Callahan, then the man investigators believed responsible for Emily Harper's disappearance had taken the truth with him to the grave. Unless something else could still be found. Because if Reese had lived under that identity for 20 years, there might still be records. Old homes. Storage units. Vehicles. Places where something connected to the Harper case might still exist. Detectives began reviewing every known address tied to Daniel Reese. One location in particular stood out. A small property outside a rural town in southern Missouri. According to records, Reese had lived there for nearly 10 years before his death. A quiet house on several acres of land. Plenty of space. Plenty of privacy. And possibly, investigators realized, the first real lead the Emily Harper cold case had seen in more than 2 decades. Because if Mark Callahan had spent years hiding under the name Daniel Reese, then the place he called home might still hold the answers he never gave. The property sat at the end of a narrow gravel road outside a small town in southern Missouri. Fields stretched in every direction. A weathered mailbox leaned slightly toward the road. Beyond it stood a modest single-story house surrounded by tall trees and an aging barn. For nearly 10 years, the man known locally as Daniel Reese had lived there alone. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite but distant. He kept to himself, worked odd mechanical jobs in nearby towns, and rarely invited anyone onto the property. Most people in the area barely knew him. To them, he was simply the quiet mechanic who fixed tractors and old pickup trucks. But to detectives from Colorado, arriving more than 2 decades after Emily Harper vanished, the land carried a different weight. If Daniel Reese truly had been Mark Callahan, then this rural property might be the first place investigators had searched that belonged to him after 2000. The cold case team from Aurora coordinated with local Missouri authorities and obtained a search warrant. On a gray morning in early spring, several police vehicles slowly rolled up the gravel driveway. The house looked almost frozen in time. Dust covered the windows. The grass had grown unevenly since Reese's death 2 years earlier. Inside, the air smelled stale. The furniture was simple and worn. A couch, a small television, a kitchen table with 2 chairs. Nothing immediately suggested a man living under a false identity. But detectives weren't looking for obvious clues. They were searching for fragments. Old documents. Photos. Anything that might connect Daniel Reese to Mark Callahan. Or to Emily Harper. Boxes of paperwork were collected. Receipts. Old tools. Employment records. In the bedroom closet, investigators found a locked metal case. Inside were several personal items. A few faded photographs. An outdated driver's license under the name Daniel Reese. And something that made one detective stop cold. A small cassette recorder. The same brand as the one found in Emily Harper's home in 2000. It didn't prove anything by itself, but it was enough to make investigators send the device to forensic technicians. Meanwhile, the search of the property continued outside. The barn behind the house looked like it hadn't been used for years. Dusty farm equipment sat along the walls. Rusting tools hung from old nails. But one section of the dirt floor looked slightly different. The soil was darker.
Disturbed at some point in the past.
Ground-penetrating radar equipment was brought in to scan the area. The machine slowly moved across the barn floor. For several minutes, nothing unusual appeared. Then a technician paused. The radar display showed something beneath the surface. A rectangular disturbance in the soil roughly 6 feet long. Detectives exchanged quiet looks. Within hours, the barn floor was carefully excavated. Layer by layer, the dirt was removed. The air inside the barn felt heavy as investigators worked. About 3 feet down, the shovel of one investigator struck something solid.
Wood.
Carefully brushing away the dirt revealed the edge of a small wooden crate. It had clearly been buried intentionally. The crate was lifted out of the ground and placed on a table inside the barn. For a long moment, no one spoke. After more than 20 years of unanswered questions, the contents of this box might finally explain what happened the night Emily Harper disappeared. A technician carefully pried open the lid. Inside were several items wrapped in old cloth. The first was a small stack of documents, old photographs.
And beneath them,
a wallet. The leather was cracked with age. But inside the wallet was something detectives instantly recognized. An identification card issued in Colorado. The name printed on it read, Mark Callahan. The photo matched the man investigators had been searching for since 2000, which meant one thing was now almost certain. Daniel Reese and Mark Callahan were the same person. But the discovery didn't answer the biggest question yet. Where was Emily Harper? Investigators continued searching the crate. More items were removed. Old letters, receipts, and finally, one last object wrapped tightly in cloth. When the fabric was unwrapped, detectives found a small gold necklace. Attached to it was a tiny pendant. Inside the pendant was a photograph. A younger Emily Harper smiling at the camera. The same necklace her family had reported missing the night she disappeared. The barn fell silent. Because if Mark Callahan had kept Emily Harper's necklace buried on his property for decades, then the truth about what happened that night was almost certainly buried there as well. And the disturbed ground beneath the barn floor suddenly looked far more important than investigators first realized. The discovery of the necklace changed everything. For more than 20 years, investigators had suspected that Mark Callahan might have been responsible for Emily Harper's disappearance. But until that moment, they had never possessed a single piece of physical evidence tying him directly to her after the night she vanished. Now they did. Emily's necklace, identified immediately by her family, had been buried inside a crate on the rural Missouri property of the man living under the name Daniel Reese. And beneath the barn floor, the ground still showed signs of disturbance beyond the spot where the crate had been hidden. The excavation resumed. Detectives worked slowly, carefully widening the dig area beneath the barn. More layers of packed dirt were removed. Several feet away from where the crate had been buried, the soil changed texture again. It became looser, less compact. Another technician ran the ground-penetrating radar over the area. The screen showed a second anomaly beneath the surface. Larger this time. Much larger. No one spoke as the team resumed digging. Each shovel of dirt brought them closer to the possibility investigators had imagined for decades, but had never proven. After another hour, the edge of something pale appeared beneath the soil. At first it was unclear what it was. Then a forensic investigator knelt down and brushed away the dirt with a small tool. The shape became unmistakable.
Bone.
Human bone. The barn grew, completely silent. Carefully, the team cleared away the surrounding dirt until more remains appeared. A rib cage. Part of a skull. The remains had been buried roughly 4 feet beneath the floor of the barn. Based on the position of the bones, the body had likely been placed there quickly, without a coffin and covered with soil. Forensic specialists immediately began documenting the site. Photographs. Measurements. Evidence markers. Although identification would require formal testing, investigators already knew the likely answer. The remains were almost certainly Emily Harper. But the burial site raised new questions. Because if Callahan, living under the name Daniel Reese, had killed Emily in Colorado in 2000, then somehow her body had traveled more than 800 miles to Missouri. That meant one of two things. Either Callahan had returned to the house in Aurora after the crime, transported her body across several states, and buried it years later on property he eventually purchased. Or Emily had never been buried in Colorado at all. She had been taken somewhere else the very night she disappeared. The timeline investigators began reconstructing was chilling. Callahan had likely left Emily's house shortly after midnight. Neighbors reported hearing a vehicle leave around that time. If Emily had been killed inside the house, her body could have been placed in that vehicle. From there, Callahan could have driven east across Kansas under the cover of darkness. Long highway stretches. Few witnesses. Within a day or two, he could have reached Missouri, a remote location where no one knew him, a place where he could start over under a new identity, and bury the only person who knew the truth about what happened between them. As the remains were carefully lifted from the ground, investigators noticed something else inside the burial pit. A small object near where the victim's hands would have been. It was partially rusted, but still recognizable. A metal clasp, attached to a length of deteriorated tape. The tape looked familiar to detectives who had studied the original case file, because in Emily Harper's living room, investigators had once found a cassette tape in her recorder that had been partially erased. Now, in the grave beneath the barn floor, they had discovered another tape, sealed decades earlier in the darkness of the soil. The object was carefully removed and sealed as evidence. If the tape inside could still be recovered, it might contain something no one had ever heard before. Perhaps the rest of the conversation that ended so abruptly inside Emily's house in Aurora. Or something even more important, a recording made by the man who had hidden both the necklace and the body. Back in Colorado, Emily Harper's family had waited more than 20 years for answers. Now, at last, investigators were close to giving them one. But the most haunting possibility still remained. Because if the tape recovered from the grave could still be restored, it might contain the only surviving record of what happened during the final moments of Emily Harper's life.